The landscape of Mars has rarely been as pivotal a setting as it was in the Red Faction games. There are a handful of games that explore the Red Planet to one degree or another though. Destiny 2, Doom, Disruptor all include Mars in their mythoi, but none of these games actually make the Red Planet as intricately part of the story as the Red Faction games do. The series started out as a story about revolution and workers' rights, wrapped up nicely in a blanket of sci-fi action into a game that, through its setting and story, asked the player to consider what might happen if an off-planet mining company took advantage of their complete lack of regulatory oversight and exploited its workers to the brink of destitution, triggering an uprising. Red Faction is the face of that rebellion, and the series put players in the shoes of pivotal characters during crucial moments of that late 21st century uprising. Later games would hang on to that basic notion, but also expand upon it and lead the story into a more futuristic and complex direction, but nothing so outlandish that it wouldn't fit with the rest of the games. With that evolution would also come the proliferation of a geomod engine that would allow the player to destroy the environment in ways that could often open up new pathways and bring a visceral level of interaction to first-person shooters that largely hadn't been seen in that genre yet. The environmental destruction was fairly minimal and gimmicky at first, by mostly being limited to certain designated areas where the player could only blow up the walls and ceilings that the game wanted them to, but by the third game the system would expand to include most of the game's world and really instilled a sense of freedom and control that would set the series apart from its contemporaries. So with all of these interesting qualities and a track record of pretty decent games, why would Red Faction only exist in our minds as a memory today? How come everybody seems to know of and think highly of the franchise, yet hasn't had the chance to play a new Red Faction game in nearly a decade? What the hell happened to Red Faction? The early 2000s was a fantastic time for fans of first-person shooters. From blockbuster games like Halo, Killzone, Timesplitters, and Half-Life, many developers of all shapes and sizes were releasing games in the genre, with a variety of settings. World War II was a popular setting early on, but the genre's focus did largely shift towards a more science fiction direction thanks to the success of many of the games mentioned. With the power of the PlayStation 2, GameCube, and the original Xbox, first-person shooters were able to look much better than they did on previous consoles, which often looked blurry and smudged thanks to the camera being so close to objects in the environment. 2001's Red Faction was a fairly large part of the popularization of the genre and was served well with its unique settings on Mars and a story of a revolt against the Altor Corporation, which was running a mining operation on Mars littered with human rights violations and a mysterious illness spreading throughout the worker class. After witnessing many of his fellow workers murdered by the tyrannical Altor officials, the main character, Parker, takes what's left of the uprising into his own hands and helps lead the workers to freedom from the corporation and to an antidote for the sickness plaguing them. The initial PlayStation 2 version of the game scored very well with reviewers and gamers alike, and many praised its well-constructed world, weapon variety, and destructible environments made possible with the geomod technology that developer, Volition, would take every possible opportunity to bring up. The PC port of Red Faction would score slightly lower, as PC gamers' expectations were generally higher than PlayStation gamers at that time, but it would feature online multiplayer while the PlayStation 2 version was local only. Even a laughable N-Gage version of the game was made, and even though it wasn't very good for the N-Gage, it wasn't that bad. Red Faction was a hit by the standards of that time and was well on its way to being a bona fide franchise in the crowded and competitive first-person shooter market. Red Faction 2, also developed by Volition and published by THQ, was received similarly to the first, with many praises about its destructibility, weapon variety, and story, although this time all three of those elements were turned up a few notches. Destructibility, while not totally free-form, was far more universal than the original game, especially in the multiplayer deathmatches, where players could carve out entire passages by strategically tunneling into walls with rocket launchers and grenades. The weapons were also more numerous, allowed dual wielding, and also took on a more futuristic tone similar to the Timesplitter weapons. All of this only added to the depth that was brought to the game with bigger levels and an improved version of the geomod engine. The story was also a more expansive one with more sides than the typical good guy bad guy dichotomy and also had a number of twists and turns. Though Red Faction 2 did pay a bit of a price for that storytelling ambition by being a little overly convoluted for such a short campaign. Still, while Red Faction 2 didn't set the world on fire, it was another solid entry for the series and helped THQ and Volition pay the rent for another few years. In 2009, gaming was different than it was on the PS2. Open world games were all the rage, and linear first-person shooters weren't nearly as popular as they used to be. Gamers didn't just want a story to be fed to them, they wanted to make things happen on their terms. In light of that, Red Faction Guerrilla would shake things up and put players in the shoes of yet another miner arriving to Mars under the Earth Defense Force's watch. Even though they were previously a staunch ally of the Red Faction, now they had become the new Ultor by forcing labor to meet the demands of Earth's dwindling resources. We're now many years past the events of the original two games, and Mars has been extensively terraformed, and while it's not quite Miami Beach, Mars is now populated and developed to the point where it actually looks like a real civilization. Outside of some expected graphical improvements from it being an entirely different generation of the previous games, Guerrilla features an open world structure, a third-person perspective, and the highest amount of destructibility the series had seen by a mile. While Red Faction 2's geomod tech was a modest improvement over the first, Red Faction Guerrilla was an entirely different beast altogether. The amount of things you couldn't completely destroy was now dwarfed by everything that you could, and due to that element of the gameplay finally reaching such an outstanding level, on top of the story and gunplay also being pretty good, Red Faction Guerrilla went on to become arguably the most popular game in the series and sell over 1 million copies within the first 6 months after its launch. Sadly, this would be the peak of the series. 2011's Red Faction Armageddon would bungle things up a little bit with a return to linear gameplay and a somewhat weaker story than Guerrilla. While it did review fairly well and maintained many of the elements that made the previous game so much fun, it just didn't make the splash that THQ needed it to in the sales department. And this lack of sales helped lead the already struggling THQ to lose tens of millions of dollars that year, and subsequent installments of Red Faction were cancelled, and THQ declared bankruptcy the next year and auctioned off all of its intellectual properties. Of course, there are many reasons why great game franchises bite the dust, and the reasons that impacted Red Faction's lifespan aren't terribly uncommon. Games can be great, but if the publishers aren't managing their own budgets and expectations accordingly, any series, no matter how great, can be at risk. Thankfully, there is a fairly large glimpse of light for the series though. After the dust settled from all of THQ's liquidations and acquisitions, many of THQ's properties ended up at Nordic Games, who went on to keep the THQ branding as THQ Nordic. Nordic has shown some signs that they plan to do more with the series, most prominent of which was their release of a remastered version of Red Faction's most successful title, Red Faction Guerrilla, which was received pretty well despite the decade-old level design and mission structure. With that and the upcoming remake of Destroy All Humans on the way, it does seem that THQ Nordic probably has a future planned for Red Faction, and with a little luck, it might not be too much longer before we can blast through a new uprising on the Red Planet. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.